Appendix 4, HSCA Procedural Write-Up, Cuba Trip 2. On August 25, 1978, Congressman Richardson Pryor and HSCA staff members G. Robert Blakey and Edwin Juan Lopez Soto traveled to Cuba from Miami at 8:25 a.m. on an air taxi service charter plane. The committee representatives arrived in Cuba at 10:15 a.m. They were met by the Minister of Justice, Armando Torres Central, Washington Consul Ricardo Escartin, American Department official Senen Buergo, and translator Nelly Ruiz de Zarate. The committee representatives were escorted to their suite, room number 2003, at the Hotel Riviera at 11 a.m. At 12:15 p.m., the committee representatives met with Ricardo Escartin, Felipe Villa, Senen Buergo, and translators Juanita Vera and Nelly Ruiz de Zarate. Also present were two Cuban stenographers. Senen Buergo, the spokesperson, welcomed the committee representatives to Cuba and thanked the committee for its correspondence. Mr. Buergo apologized on behalf of the Cuban government for the postponement of a previously scheduled trip of May 24th and 25th, 1978. Mr. Buergo stressed that, in his opinion, there was a conspiracy to link Cuba to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. At that point, he handed 4 files to Congressman Richardson Pryor. The files consisted of A. Material concerning Santo Traficante, B. A letter dated 25th of November 1963 from Hernandez Armas, Mexican ambassador in 1962, to Raul Roa, Minister of Foreign Relations in 1963, C. The results of the Cuban government's research into misinformation linking the Cuban government to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and D. The report of the Investigative Committee of the International Tribunal of the 11th Festival reporting on the defamation campaign to link Cuba to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Mr. Buergo stated that both Eusebio Azcu Lopez and Alfredo Mirabal Diaz would that day be made available for interviews. Mr. Buergo stated that Nilo Otero would be made available for interview the following day, 26th of August, 1978. Footnote: in 1963, Nilo Otero, as an official in the Cuban government's Ministry of Foreign Relations, interviewed Eusebio Azcu about Lee Harvey Oswald's visits to the Cuban consulate. End footnote. Mr. Buergo stated that Rogelio Rodriguez was presently stationed in West Germany. Footnote: in 1963, the Cuban government employed Rogelio Rodriguez at the Cuban embassy. The committee wished to interview Mr. Rodriguez about Lee Harvey Oswald's visits to the Cuban embassy and employees' reactions to the Kennedy assassination. End footnote. Buergo stated that Ricardo Escartin previously interviewed Mr. Rodriguez and was told by Rodriguez that he had had no contact with Lee Harvey Oswald. Mr. Buergo stated that if the committee still desired to interview Rodriguez, he would be made available to the committee. Mr. Buergo stated that an interview with Rolando Cubela Secades would be arranged. Footnote: Rolando Cubela, known as Amlash, was prominent in the Senate Select Committee's Book 5, which reported the possibility that the Central Intelligence Agency's attempts to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro provoked the Cuban government to orchestrate the assassination of President Kennedy in retaliation. End footnote. Mr. Buergo asked if the committee was still interested in interviewing Orestes Guillermo Ruiz Perez. Footnote: in 1963, the Cuban government employed Orestes Guillermo Ruiz Perez at the Cuban embassy. The committee wished to interview Mr. Rodriguez about Lee Harvey Oswald's visits to the Cuban consulate and about the Cuban embassy employees' reactions to the Kennedy assassination. In addition, Mr. Ruiz is the cousin-in-law of one of the most active anti-Castroites, Antonio Veciana Blanch. End footnote. Mr. Buergo stated that the Cuban government had no record of a citizen named Grisel Rubio. Footnote: Grisel Rubio claimed in a letter, December 1963, to DRI that Ruby had been in Cuba in 1962 or 1963 visiting Solomon Pratkins. The committee located and interviewed Miss Rubio in Miami. End footnote. Mr. Buergo inquired whether the committee representatives were interested in watching the videotaped statements of James Wilcott and Philip Agee at the tribunal. Footnote: James Wilcott is an ex-CIA employee who appeared voluntarily in August 1978 at the Cuban government's tribunal, which accused the CIA of complicity in the John F. Kennedy assassination. Philip Agee is an ex-CIA employee who appeared voluntarily in August 1978 at the Cuban government's tribunal, which accused the CIA of complicity in the John F. Kennedy assassination. The tribunal, held in August 1978, was an effort by the Cuban government to accuse the CIA of complicity in the John F. Kennedy assassination. Ex-CIA agents James Wilcott and Philip Agee testified at the tribunal, along with ex-Cuban consul in Mexico, Eusebio Azcue. End footnote. Congressman Pryor responded that the committee's representatives would want to view the Wilcott and Agee videotaped statements. Mr. Buergo stated that our schedule included dinner with the Minister of Justice at 8 p.m. on 25th of August, 1978, fishing on 27th of August, 1978, Sunday, and a farewell dinner on 28th of August, 1978. Congressman Pryor thanked the Cuban officials for making both the documents and witnesses available to the Select Committee. Professor Blakey stated that the committee was no longer interested in interviewing Rolando Cubella. Mr. Blakey stated that Grisel Rubio had been found in Miami and interviewed by a committee investigator. Mr. Blakey stated that the committee wanted to interview Oreste Guillermo Ruiz Perez for two reasons. He worked at the Cuban embassy in September 1963 when Oswald allegedly visited the Cuban compound in Mexico City, and he is married to the cousin of a counter-revolutionary, Antonio Veciana Blanch. Mr. Blakey stated that Rogelio Rodriguez need not be interviewed. Captain Felipe Villa stated that the Cuban government, relying on the seriousness and honesty of the committee's work, thought that the committee should have knowledge of Cubella's statements. Mr. Villa stated that the committee still needed to provide the Cuban government with the following: A workable formula on counter-revolutionaries that could be used by the Cuban government to aid the committee in its investigation of such organizations; B, copies of Lee Harvey Oswald's signatures that the Cuban government could use to perform its own handwriting comparison test; and C, E. Howard Hunt's aliases. Mr. Blakey stated that examples of Lee Harvey Oswald's handwriting would be forthcoming. Mr. Blakey stated that the committee had not yet developed a formula for identifying counter-revolutionary groups active against the Cuban government in 1963, or a method for providing E. Howard Hunt's aliases. Mr. Blakey stressed that both these areas would be discussed in the committee's final report. At 1 p.m., the first work session ended. At 3:15 p.m., House Select Committee on Assassinations representatives interviewed Juan Nilo Otero in room 2003 of the Hotel Riviera. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez Soto, Senen Buergo, Ricardo Escartin, Captain Felipe Villa, translator Juanita Vera, and two stenographers. The interview ended at 5:15 p.m. At 8 p.m., the committee's representatives met Senen Buergo and translator Nelly Ruiz de Zarade at the Hotel Riviera's lobby. The group was chauffeured to the Bodeguita del Medio, one of Cuba's most famous restaurants, where they dined with the Minister of Justice, Armando Torres Santrael. At 10:15 a.m., 26th of August, 1978, Select Committee representatives interviewed Alfredo Mirabal Diaz in room 2003 at the Hotel Riviera. Footnote: Alfredo Mirabal Diaz assumed the consul position in the Cuban government's Mexico City consulate on September 2, 1963. He was present during all of Oswald's visits to the consulate. End footnote. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez Soto, Senen Buergo, Captain Felipe Villa, Ricardo Escartin, translators Juanita Vera and Nelly Ruiz de Zarade, and two stenographers. The interview ended at 12:45 p.m. After the Mirabal interview, Mr. Buergo asked whether the HSCA representatives wished to interview Jose Verdacia, the warden of Trescornia, while Santos Traficante was a detainee. Footnote: the committee wished to question Mr. Verdacia about the identities of the organized crime figures detained in Trescornia at the inception of the Cuban revolutionary government. End footnote. When Congressman Richardson Pryor stated that the committee would indeed be interested in interviewing Jose Verdacia, Mr. Buergo stated that he would be available for an interview at 3 p.m. At 3:30 p.m., HSCA representatives interviewed Jose Verdacia in room 2003 of the Hotel Riviera. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez Soto, Senen Buergo, Captain Felipe Villa, Ricardo Escartin, Reyes Gutierrez, translators Juanita Vera and Nelly Ruiz de Zarade, and 2 stenographers. The interview ended at 4:20 p.m. On Sunday morning, 27th of August, 1978, the Cuban government's representatives took the Select Committee representatives to Veradero Beach. At 8:35 p.m., Select Committee representatives interviewed Orestes Guillermo Ruiz Perez at the Hotel Internacional at Veradero Beach. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juana Lopez Soto, Ricardo Escartin, Captain Felipe Villa, Senen Buergo, and translator Juanita Vera. Because there were no stenographers present, the Cuban representatives tape-recorded the interview. The interview ended at 9:20 p.m. On 28th of August, 1978, at 10:25 a.m., HSCA representatives interviewed Rolando Cubela Sacades in room 2003 at the Hotel Riviera. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez Soto, Ricardo Escartin, Captain Felipe Villa, Senen Buergo, translator Juanita Vera, and Nelly Ruiz de Zarade, and 2 stenographers. Also present was Antonio Hernandez, who escorted Mr. Cubela from prison to the hotel. The interview ended at 11:45 p.m. At 3:25 p.m., HSCA representatives interviewed Maria Teresa Proenza y Proenza in room 2003 at the Hotel Riviera. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez Soto, Ricardo Escartin, Captain Felipe Villa, Senen Buergo, Antonio Hernandez, translator Nelly Ruiz de Zarade, and 2 stenographers. Footnote: in 1963, the Cuban government employed Maria Teresa Proenza y Proenza at the Cuban embassy. The committee wished to interview Ms. Proenza about Lee Harvey Oswald's visits to the Cuban consulate and about the Cuban embassy employees' reactions to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Also, see HSCA interview of Maria Teresa Proenza y Proenza, August 28, 1978, JFK document. End footnote. The interview ended at 4:15 p.m. On 29th of August, 1978, at 9:30 a.m., the HSCA representatives met the Cuban delegation for a final work session in room 2003 of the Hotel Riviera. Present were Congressman Richardson Pryor, G. Robert Blakey, Edwin Juan Lopez, Ricardo Escartin, Senen Buergo, Captain Felipe Villa, translators Juanita Vera and Nelly Ruiz de Zarade, and 2 stenographers. The Cuban delegation spokesperson, Senen Buergo, explained that Mr. Manuel Piñero was out of the country, and therefore an interview could not be arranged. Footnote: in 1963, Manuel Piñero, chief of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, interviewed Eusebio Azcue about Lee Harvey Oswald's visits to the Cuban consulate. In addition, Mr. Piñero was the Cuban revolutionary government official who met with Santo Traficante and gave him 24 hours to leave the country. End footnote. Mr. Buergo explained that the Cuban delegation had located Luisa Calderon Carralero, but because she was ill, an interview could not be arranged. Mr. Buergo suggested that the HSCA forward questions to the Cuban government. Ms. Calderon's answers would then be forwarded to the committee. Mr. Buergo explained that Raul Roa had a very busy schedule. Mr. Roa felt that he could not add any more information to what Nilo Otero had already provided and declined the interview. Material handed to the HSCA representatives at this time included A list of persons whom the Cuban delegation believed to have had close relations with Santo Traficante, B, photographs depicting what the Cuban government believed to be a Central Intelligence Agency photographic surveillance base targeted against the Cuban consulate and embassy in Mexico City during 1963, C, an essay entitled Imperialism's Political, Economic, and Military Organizations and Agencies of Crime, such as the CIA, and D, an article entitled Finally, We Have Eliminated That Pinto in the White House, said Bob when he heard about JFK's assassination. The final work session ended at 11 a.m. At 1 p.m., the Cuban delegation escorted the committee's representatives to the airport. At the airport, they were bade farewell by the Minister of Justice, Armando Torres Central, Sinenbuergo, Juanita Vera, and Nelly Ruiz de Zarade. At 3:30 p.m., the HSCA representatives and Washington consul Ricardo Escartin departed Cuba.